Hi everyone, greetings, and I hope all the fellow pilots and all the fans of Eurofly 3 who've been watching this series have a nice day today. Perhaps today's part 13 of the basic tutorial series is going to make it even more pleasant for you. Today we'll still be talking about airports just like we did last time, and we will talk about something that is closely related to the airports themselves, and that is their surroundings. In real life, pilots don't only have maps for the airports themselves so that they can get around and orient themselves, especially at unknown airports that they're not yet familiar with, but they also have maps for the airport surroundings. Because, there's terrain around the airports and it can vary a lot, it can be very irregular, and that's why it is important for a pilot to know how low and when you can descend. There is a safe area, the so-called same altitude safe circle around airports, where you know that you can reach a certain altitude, but that doesn't always have to mean that you can reach or you can descend this low to this altitude very far away from the airport, because you could crash into a hill or something. So that's why it is important to know not only how low you can descend, but also when and where, how far from the airport you can descend to that altitude. And that's what the descent maps are used for. We also have these descent maps in Eurofly 3, and I'm going to be demonstrating them today. So let's get into free flights yet again. Schedule free flights.
Free flight dial.
I'm going to use the rental offer again because I need to
rental offer combo box England.
I need to choose an airport.
Rental offer combo box Slovakia Poprad.
I know I'm still in Slovakia, but I'm using airports that I know that are good for these demonstration purposes, and this one is very close to the Tatry mountain range, which is the largest mountain range in Slovakia. So that's going to be perfect.
Plane select. Beechcraft, Cessna 175 Sky, Cessna 182 Skyliner, Cessna 206, Cessna 200, Cessna 170.
Yeah, let's still take this small plane. Why not?
Dashboard window.
I just like flying with it, So let me turn on the onboard computer.
Computer on. Fuel low.
Oh, we're without fuel again. I have to.
Fuel low.
1000.
Refuel. Sorry about that. This happens because the plane is rented. If I was using my own plane, obviously there would be as much fuel left as there was the last time that I left the plane, that I finished my last flight. So now we are at the
Airport Poprad, Tatry.
Poprad Airport in Tatry in the mountain range, and we can see in the airport properties, if we open them,
combo box pilot Lucas Hosnadel,
that this airport's height above sea level,
height above sea level 712 m,
is 712 meters, so it's pretty high.
Dashboard.
Let me remind you about the semicolon key that I was talking about way back when I was talking about how to read and how to move around the map. It may be called differently in different keyboard layouts again, but I'm referring to the key which is to the right of the L letter. You just need to use the key that's to the right of the L.
712.
And this key always reports the current height above sea level, not of our plane, not our altitude, but it is the height above sea level of that very geographical point of the terrain where I'm currently located, whether it is on the map or whether it is the place that I'm currently flying over. So this terrain, this airport where I'm at right now, has a height above sea level of 712 meters. So we're now at the airport, and the semicolon key has told me that the height above sea level for this very airport, for this place, is 712 meters. But if I was airborne, if I was already flying and I was a kilometer or two away from the airport and I used the semicolon key again, it could easily have told me that the height above sea level was now 1 or 2 kilometers, 2,000 meters. So the semicolon key always tells me the height above sea level for the terrain below me that I'm currently flying over, where I'm at right now. So even though the airport has a height above sea level of 712 meters, it's very easily possible that the height above sea level, or the elevation, can increase or drop very significantly by quite a lot, even over a relatively short distance, especially when you're flying near mountain ranges. Control semicolon then tells me how far ahead in the direction that I'm currently facing there's an object with a greater height above sea level. How far that object is and how tall it is.
2,1 km Gerlach of 767 m 1 minutes.
So we're currently facing north. We're at the airport, and we heard that just 2.1 kilometers ahead of us in that direction to the north, there's a mountain which already has a height of sea level
2,1 km Gerlach of 767 m 1 minutes.
767, so it's at least 50 meters of difference in the height above sea level. So if I was now taking off from here to the north, I would probably be very likely to fly over that hill or to be able to climb above it in time. But there could have been a much higher mountain in that direction. There could have been one with a height above the sea level, for instance, of 2,000 meters or 2 kilometers. So that would have been much more difficult to climb above when taking off in that direction. So that's probably why we shouldn't even be attempting to take off from here in that direction to the north. And we certainly shouldn't be trying to land at this airport in that direction. The problem is when approaching the airport and going for the landing or wanting to land there, in knowing how far, how low, and when, at which point can we go safely. That is what the descend map is used for. Such a descend map is available for every airport, and we can bring it up and we can read it by displaying the airport properties like we did last time with Shift-Enter.
Combo box pilot Lucas Hosnittel, 1, collapsed.
But we're not going to be reading the basic information that we're already familiar with using the arrow keys, but instead we are going to press Tab.
Combo box descend map collapsed.
And we heard descend map. We've just entered the second part of this window, or of this screen if you will, where we can view this map. So if I now press the down arrow key,
height above sea level 712 m.
We can hear it is reiterated even here that the height above sea level for the current airport is 712 meters.
Same altitude safe circle 0,0 km.
The same altitude safe circle. This is a very important piece of information, and it is 0 kilometers in the case of this airport. What does that mean? That means if it was saying, for example, 0.3 kilometers, 300 meters, or 500 meters, or 1 kilometer, that would mean that if you were less than 1 kilometer away from the airport in either direction, you would be able to climb as low as the airport's actual height above sea level already within 1 kilometer away from the airport, because there were no hills, no mountains, no terrain obstacles anywhere in any direction near the airport at that distance, at that altitude. Essentially, this would mean that if there was the same altitude safe circle of 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers, that this distance beyond the airport is just level terrain, flat. There's no irregularities in the terrain. But since this airport in Poprad in Tatry in the mountain range has a same altitude safe circle of 0 kilometers, 0 meters, that means there is terrain. There are some mountains even that close to the airport. So imagine a circle with a point in its center. That point is the airport, and the circle is the terrain around it within the specified distance. So this airport has basically no safe circle. There's terrain in some direction above the airport, very close to it. But you can easily come across airports where the same altitude safe circle would be 5 kilometers or even up to 10 kilometers. That would mean the airport is built on a completely flat and level terrain. That would mean that even these 5 or 10 kilometers away from the airport, you could safely descend all the way to the altitude or to the height above sea level of the very airport. Well, not all the way because you would crash into the ground, but you could go, for instance, 20 meters above ground, and you could be approaching the airport from that low of an altitude, even from within the 10 kilometers, which is not the case here though. So now we are going to keep reading the descent map, and we'll learn about the distances and their respective altitudes farther and farther away from the airport. When you have the circle with the point with the airport in its center, just imagine more circles with the same center, with the same point in the center, which is the airport, but these circles keep getting larger and larger as we're going farther and farther away from the airport. So that altitude for these circles, for these larger distances, can and will get higher as we keep reading. So we know that there's basically no same altitude safe circle for this very airport. And if I now keep going,
2 kilometers safe altitude 748 m, which is 36 m above ground.
2 kilometers safe altitude
2 kilometers safe altitude 748 m, which is 36 m above ground.
Meters, which is 36 meters above ground. That means that if we were less than 2 kilometers away from the airport, we would need to have a higher altitude. We could not afford to be at the altitude of the airport of 712, but we would need to have an altitude of 748, I believe it was, which would be 36 meters above ground, where the ground, the reference point in this case, is the airport or the center of the airport. So if we needed to make a circle around the airport, if we needed to fly around it within this distance, within 2 kilometers or less than 2 kilometers away from it, because say we were not able to approach and to descend low enough in time for landing, so that we now need to make a circle around it, we could easily be flying at the altitude of 748, which would be 36 meters above ground in this case, and it would be completely safe in all directions around this airport within this distance. Let's move on.
5 kilometers safe altitude 962 m, which is 250 m above ground.
Well, you see, 5 kilometers, the circle got larger. That means if we were approaching the airport and under the Control N keystroke, we could keep watching our distance from the airport. And if we were less than 5 kilometers away, let's say if Control N told us that we were 4.9 kilometers away from the airport, the safe altitude in that case would be
5 kilometers safe altitude 962 m, which is 250 m above ground,
which would already be 250 meters above ground. So we would need to be flying much higher than we would at the smaller circle, at the 2 kilometers circle, if we were flying around the airport. If we needed to make a circle around it, we could be flying around the airport in all directions when less than 5 kilometers away from it, but only at this altitude, only at 962 meters, I think it was. Of course, it doesn't mean that there are hills or terrain obstacles everywhere, all around the airport, in all directions at this altitude. Not at all, but it just tells us that there is some obstacle or hill somewhere in some direction next to the airport. That's why we could make like 3/4 of a circle at a lower altitude, but we would just crash into the ground if we were flying lower and we were approaching the airport, say, from the north. That's why we need to respect the safe altitude, this circle, when flying around the airport, even if there is no hill or mountain right in front of us right now. But if we were to make a full circle, there would be some obstacle in a different direction, and we would crash into it if we were flying lower than what the safe altitude circle for 5 kilometers specifies. So this specific airport is situated or located so that there's this Tatry mountain range to the north of it, but to the south the terrain is comparatively more level, more flat. That means that if we were coming in from the south, if we were located south of the airport, we could, in theory, descend even lower than that safe altitude circle. But if we did make a circle around the airport at this distance, we would crash to the north of the airport. These descent maps are supposed to protect us from crashing into terrain, and that's why they tell us how low we can go, how low we can descend when flying around the airport to fly safely. That is their purpose. That is why, if we're located less than 5 kilometers away from the airport, but more than 2, we just simply don't go below the threshold of 962. Because somewhere around the airport, there is an obstacle lower than that. And if we are going within this safe height, we can safely circle all around the airport and, for instance, align ourselves for the landing.
10 kilometers safe altitude 1,651 m, which is 939 m above ground.
The safety circle is getting larger, but also the safe altitude for that distance is getting higher. We heard that at the distance of 10 kilometers, it's already 1,600 something meters.
15 kilometers safe altitude 2,436 m, which is 1,724 m above ground.
At 15 kilometers from the airport, the safe altitude is already 2,400 something meters. That's exactly because of the mountain range nearby. So if you were to approach this Poprad airport and you were less than 15 kilometers away from it, say 14.9 kilometers, definitely do not make a circle all around the airport at an altitude that is lower than the mentioned safe altitude of 2,400 something meters, because you would just crash into the terrain somewhere around the airport at one side.
20 kilometers safe altitude 2,436 m, which is 1,724 m above ground.
The larger the distance from the airport, the higher the safe altitude circle is. You can see that it's getting progressively larger.
30 kilometers safe altitude 2,436 m, which is 1,724 m above
30
ground.
kilometers.
50 kilometers safe altitude 2,436 m, which is 1,724 m above ground.
50 kilometers, the altitude doesn't change as much anymore here.
100 kilometers safe altitude 2,436 m, which is 1,724 m above ground.
100 kilometers. That means that based on this information, we can and we should be able to safely descend in order to approach and circle the airport. You may now be wondering how to watch this information during flight. You may be saying, and rightly so, that it's pretty impractical to keep opening up the airport properties all the time as you're flying and as you're approaching the airport. That's why there are two keys available to us, and we've already demonstrated them some time ago. And these are the comma key and the period key. Again, comma should be to the right of the M letter, and period is to the right of that. I'm going to leave the properties now.
Dashboard window.
And I'm going to press period.
0 above ground.
It said that we are currently 0 above ground because we are on the ground, we are at the airport. But if I was currently flying, if I was airborne, this key would tell me at any time how high above the ground I was at this very moment. Now, if I press the comma key...
2 kilometers safe altitude 748 m, which is 36 m above ground.
This is always going to tell me the current safe circle for the nearest airport that I'm flying over. That means that without me having to constantly look for this information myself manually and without having to be worried about what the current safe circle is, it is always going to tell me now the program decided or evaluated correctly that I was less than 2 kilometers away from the airport. So if I press comma, it tells me that the current safe altitude circle for the distance of less than 2 kilometers
2 kilometers safe altitude 748 m, which is 36 m above ground.
748 meters, which is 36 meters above ground. So since we are at the airport, that is essentially the very altitude of the airport. So comma and period are related to each other, where comma always tells me at any moment, at any given time, how high, or rather how low, I can be at that very moment, the lowest possible altitude that I can go to, and period always tells me how high above the ground I currently actually am at that moment. You may be worried that it is a bit difficult to keep reading this information and to make any sense of it if trying to land at the airport at the assigned landing runway, because we don't know in which direction from the airport the terrain obstacles, the hills are. Yes, you're right, and that is why these safe altitude circles are not that useful to us when actually going for the landing, but they're rather there for us to know how high or low we can go when making circles around the airport, not so much for the landing itself. So this information is only useful when we need to be moving around the airport in some way, and we need to know how low we can be in order to do that safely. When we are already about to land, there's a different part of the descent map used for that. But let's take another look into the airport properties. Shift enter.
Combo box pilot.
And first, let's find in the basic properties how many runways there are here.
L difficulty ground approach runways 1.
There's just one.
Runway 0927, 2599 m.
It is the runway 0927, which is 2,599 meters long. So this one runway is going due east to due west. So there's only two possibilities for landing for us. Either we could be coming in from the east and landing at the direction of 270 degrees, or the other way around. We could be coming in from the west, and we would, in that case, land at the direction of 90 degrees. I'm now going to press tab again to get back to the actual descent map.
Combo box descent map.
I'm going to
5 kilometers.
move past these
15,
safe altitude circles
30, 50, 1,
that we've already seen. And now here, there are specific descent points for the given runway. And that is what's important for landing.
Runway 09. 2,9 km descent to 763 m, which is 51 m above ground.
Runway 09. So let's imagine we're approaching the Poprad airport. We're coming in from the west. There is the course of 90 degrees under the S key, and we are already aligned with this runway ahead of time. We know we'll be landing at this runway, and we do know that within, say, 20 kilometers of the airport, there's a certain safe altitude circle. It's something over 2 kilometers. But what we are interested in now at this moment is how low we can go at this given direction, because we already know where we'll be landing and we are already aligned with that runway. So we don't need to care about a circle around the airport. We don't need to care about what terrain there might be at the other side of the airport than where we're coming in from. And here we learn
runway
that if we are already at 2.9 kilometers away from the runway or less,
2,9 km descent to 763 m, which is 51 m above ground.
that we can go all the way down to the altitude of 763 meters, which is
2,9 km descent to 763 m, which is 51 m above ground.
51 meters above ground. So this is 2.9 kilometers before where the airport or the actual runway begins.
5,5 km descent to 895 m, which is 183 m above ground.
895.
5,5 km descent to 895 m, which is 183 m above ground.
183 meters above ground. 10 kilometers, the distance is getting larger.
13 kilometers descent to 900.
13 kilometers,
13
sorry.
kilometers descent to 916 m, which is 204 m above ground. 70 kilometers descent to
70 kilometers.
70 kilometers descent to 916 m, which is 204 m above ground.
916, which is 240 above ground. And that's it. There's no more information here beyond that distance, because that is already quite a large distance anyway. So if we were already somehow aligned to the runway, if we knew where we would be landing, if we were assigned a runway and were already aligned with it within 70 kilometers away from the airport, we could descend to
10 kilometers, 70 kilometers descent to 916 m, which is 204 m above ground.
916 meters, which would be 204 above ground. Let's imagine we're reading this backwards from the bottom. So we're flying, we're approaching the Poprad airport. We're 80 kilometers away from it. And now, if we're already less than 70 kilometers away from the airport,
70,
we could descend
70 kilometers descent to 916 m, which is 204 m above ground.
916 meters, which would be 240 above ground. Now, we're less than 13 kilometers away from the airport. We can easily go
13 kilometers
to
descent to 916 m, which is 204 m above ground.
altitude 916, which is 204 meters above ground. So at this point, if we're already coming in for the landing and we are already aligned with the runway at this point, we can just care about the actual height above ground that this part of the descent maps gives us, that the descent points for the specific runway give us. It doesn't matter that the same altitude safe circle is different. We don't care because we're not about to circle the airport at this point. If the safety circle was, say, 50 kilometers was 2,000 meters, that doesn't matter to us at this point anymore, because that hill or mountain is somewhere completely different than the direction that I'm coming in from. So that's why it doesn't interest me anymore at this point. So my distance is 13 kilometers from the airport.
13 kilometers descend to 916 m, which is 204 m above ground.
I'm aligned with the runway. I know I can go 204 meters above ground. 5,5
km descend to 895 m, which is 183 m above ground.
I know I can descend to 183 meters above ground.
2,9 km descend to 763 m, which is 51 m above ground.
I can go to 51 meters above ground. So if I managed to be prepared and aligned with the runway in time, and I've already reached the airport, as soon as we hear the text-to-speech announce the word airport, that means we've already reached the airport, we're already flying over the airport itself, we know that we can go as low as the actual height above sea level for the airport itself. So we're no longer worrying about the terrain around the airport. So we're now 50 meters above ground. We could go much lower than that. We could go, say, down to 20 meters above ground, and that would then let us land safely and softly at the assigned runway. And for some reason, if I wasn't able to make the landing, if I passed the airport and would now need to start circling it again to come back on course for the runway, I know that I'm just 20 meters above ground because I was going for the landing, but now I will need to start making a circle around the airport. That's where I start worrying about the safe altitude circles again. That's where I'm going to use the comma key.
2 kilometers safe altitude 748 m, which is 36 m above ground.
And it's going to tell me that as long as I'm less than 2 kilometers away from the airport, I would need to be at least 36 meters above ground. Since I was at 20 meters above ground because I was coming in for the landing, I need to climb higher. I need to climb to at least 36 meters above ground. And I could easily start making the circle around the airport at this height, but I could not get further away from the airport than these 2 kilometers. If I did, I would need to climb even higher than that. And the comma key would then always tell me the current safe altitude circle based on my actual distance from the airport. So if I did get farther than 2 kilometers away from the airport and less than 5, the next press of the comma key would tell me the safe altitude circle for the 5 kilometers distance. So if I did get farther away than 2 kilometers away from the airport, the safe altitude circle for 5 kilometers is
safe
already
altitude 962 m, which is 250 m above ground.
250 meters above ground. So if I was attempting to circle the airport 5 kilometers away from it while being just 36 meters above ground, that would be very unsafe. I would need to climb to the 250 meters above ground altitude. Or I could turn around to be facing the airport again and pay very much attention not to get further than the 2 kilometers away from the airport. But that would probably make it much more difficult for us to align ourselves with the runway properly, so it is up to the pilot's skills and judgment to decide which of these two strategies is going to be better in this case. Let's also take a look at the case where I was to land at runway 27.
Runway 09, runway 27.
Let's also read it from the bottom or backwards. So I'm less than 70 kilometers away from the airport, aligned with the 27 runway.
70 kilometers descend to 938 m, which is 226 m above ground.
I can get as low as 226 meters above ground. If I get closer than 34 kilometers.
34 kilometers descend to 938 m, which is 226 m above ground.
I still need to be at 226 above ground.
15 kilometers descend to 871 m, which is 159 m above ground.
But at 15 kilometers or less, I can already descend
15 kilometers descend to 871 m, which is 159 m above ground.
159 above ground.
9,2 km
9.2 kilometers.
9,2 km descend to 775 m, which is 63 m above ground.
I can be as low as 63 above ground already.
Runway 27. 9,2.
And there's no more descent point for this runway. So this runway is steeper. It's more difficult to land on because we need to wait longer at a higher altitude, and only when actually within the airport on course for this runway we can get as low as 20 meters above ground. So this is what the descent maps are used for and how we can read them. But let's also mention that the descent maps provide us even with a third type of information, if you will. And these are the navigation points for each runway. I'm going to press tab again.
Combo box waypoints collapsed.
I've entered the third part of the properties screen, and here each runway has descent waypoints for it. At the Poprad Airport, there are two runways, 09 and 27. That means that we're going to see waypoints labeled 9A, 9B, 9C, 9D, and the same for 27. There will be waypoints 27A up to 27E. There are virtual waypoints which can help us align ourselves with the runway if it proves difficult for us, because they're placed in a straight line, one after another, at the direction, at the course for the runway, but at ever increasing distances.
9A, 2 kilometers 90 left.
9A is 2 kilometers away from the runway.
9B, 5 kilometers 90 left.
9B is 5 kilometers.
9C, 10 kilometers 90 left.
9C is 10 kilometers.
9D, 15 kilometers 90 left.
9D is 15 kilometers.
9D, 27A.
And there's not a 9E actually.
27A.
27A is at 2
27A.
kilometers. 27B.
27B, 5 kilometers
5
90
kilometers.
27C, 10 kilometers.
27C, 10 kilometers.
27D.
27D, 15 kilometers. The benefit of these waypoints is that they can be added into the navigation
27D.
with the space bar.
27D, 15 kilometers 90 right. Destination set.
So I've just set my destination to the point 27D for the Poprad Airport, which is
27D, 15 kilometers.
15 kilometers away from it. So then when I actually get here, I'll be 15 kilometers
27D, 15 kilometers.
away from the airport, and I'll be going on course for this waypoint. So then my only remaining task will be to properly align myself to the direction of 270 degrees to go due west for the runway. If I didn't manage to do that in time for any reason, I still have time. I can still use these other waypoints.
27C, 10 kilometers.
27C,
27B, 5 kilometers
27B, or
27A, 2 kilometers 90 right.
27A, which are closer to the airport, so that I will still be able to make use of the navigation, so that when I'm then actually entering the airport, I'm properly aligned to the course of 270 degrees, and I can go for the landing. So this part of the descent map doesn't help us with the altitude, but rather with the direction or with the course to align ourselves properly with the runway. When we're talking about this, let's also mention one more important system that helps us with this task. That is a service provided by the airport that is going to conclude our talk about airports, and that is the system which is called ILS. It's a system which we cannot use at this point because it only works during the actual flight, and it is a navigation system of the airport which helps planes align with the respective landing runways. We use the system firstly to be able to safely land at the assigned runway in the first place, but also to be able to determine the proper runway in case there are multiple parallel runways at the airport going in the same direction. it is quite common that there's not just one runway, let's say 0927 at the airport, but there could easily be 2 or 3 of them. In that case, they would be labeled 09L for a left, 09C for center if there were 3 of them, and 09R for right. In that case, we use the ILS to help determine which of these 3 parallel landing runways we will be using, because they're all running in the same direction. No matter which one of them we were assigned, we're still coming in at the same course of 90 degrees. So it is the ILS system that we're going to use to specify which one of them we want to land on. ILS is used when we're approaching the airport. We are already aligned to the correct course for the runway, so S tells us 90 degrees in this case, and we're 5 or less kilometers away from the airport. We press the keystroke Control S, and that brings up a menu of all the possible runways with this direction, with this course, that are available at the airport. After pressing Control S, we would see all the 09 runways here. 09L, 09C, and 09R to continue our example. But if we were coming in at a course of 100 degrees, we would instead see the runways that do run in the direction of 100 degrees. And if we saw nothing at all, that would mean that we're coming in at the wrong course, and there are no runways at this airport at our current course. But in any case, let's say we're seeing these 3 09 runways, 09L, 09R, and 09C. In that case, we select the correct one with Enter. Let's say the control tower has assigned us the runway 09C to land on, so we press Enter on that one to select it. And then the ILS system is going to guide us automatically from that point on, so that we do arrive at the runway at the correct direction and that our course doesn't change anymore. You may have already noticed during your own flights that as you're approaching the airport, you can see different values under the N key. The direction of the airport keeps changing slightly all the time. It could be either 1 degree off to the left or 1 degree off to the right or dead ahead. That is because we control and enter the direction of the plane using just integer numbers. Our steering controls are not precise enough or detailed enough for us to be able to specify the course in decimal points, but it is actually needed sometimes because the actual direction that the airport is at may not always be an integer number. For instance, it could be 89.9 or 90.1. So the ILS system is going to set the course of our plane at exactly the right direction, and in that way it's going to prevent us from straying away from that direction, from that point on. If we have used the ILS successfully, we'll then hear, when using the S key, we'll hear say 90.2 ILS. So we are approaching the Poprad airport, we're aligned with the runway, we're less than 5 kilometers away from it, we press Ctrl S to bring up the ILS screen, we select the 09C runway, for instance. Our direction under the S key was due 90 until this point, but after having used the ILS, it could easily be, say, 90.2 ILS. And that is the precise landing direction. The plane keeps that direction from then on, and we don't need to use the arrow keys anymore from that point. In fact, we can't even do that, because if we did change our direction by pressing the left or right arrow key, that would disable the ILS. We would need to realign ourselves with the runway in that case and use the ILS again. So if we've used the ILS properly, Our only remaining job from that point on will be just to keep watching our altitude, our speed, and our nose angle, and then we can land properly. And this concludes part 13 of our basic tutorial series on Eurofly 3, and it also concludes all the important topics that you need to know about airports in order to be able to land safely and successfully. So by now you should have all the information you need to be able to get in the cockpit of your plane, start it up, and safely take off, fly, and land successfully at your final destination. The next upcoming parts from this point on are going to be bonus or extra additional information, if you will, but they can still be interesting. For instance, the very next one, part 14, is going to talk about the communicator, which you may or may not use during your flight to be able to talk to the other pilots. That is entirely up to you. In any case, I already wish you, even now, at this point, to be able to have many successful flights under your belts, and not only a lot of successfully flown kilometers or miles, if you will, but especially as many successful and safe takeoffs and landings as possible.